What is up, YouTube? I'm Indexed, and today we're gonna be continuing the Squid Game What If series. We're gonna be continuing our last episode with the sequel, What If Season 2 characters played in the Season 1 games. So, let's start off. Firstly, let's get clear the circumstances of the situation. Every single event that originally occurred in Season 2 still occurs in the same way up until the second game, which would be Dalgona. The Giyun would return to the games, help people in red light, green light, and the vote would still favor the circles. Since it's the way Season 1 had its voting policy, they wouldn't have patches handed to them and the vote wouldn't be held after each game unless somebody requested it. So, the Giyun would still start to form a little group before his next game consisting of him, Jung-bae, In-ho, and Dae-ho. He'll start to tell everybody that the next game up is 6-legged pentathlon, so he started to tell everybody to pick teams of 5. Everybody would pick the same teams as they originally did, and Giyun's crew would still want Junie on their team to help save a pregnant woman. So they'd walk into Dalgona and everybody would be surprised that it's not 6 legs. Player 100 and a bunch of other guys would call out Giyun for this, while everybody thinks about what shape to pick. So here's how shape picking would go. Alright, let's go through with some rationales for this. For triangle, starting off with Jung-bae, I think that In-ho is intentionally going to trip up the entirety of Giyun's crew and convince them all to pick different shapes. So someone in the group is going to get lucky. Let's just say it's Jung-bae in this situation. Originally, I think Junhee is going to want to pick circle, but she will take a look at the door order right here. I figured Myung-gi will try to join circle just to be with Junhee, but she'd get pissed off by this, to which she'd move to the next door over, which is the triangle. Player 100 would get lucky, and 7 and 149 would of course go together. For the circle crew, of course Myung-gi is there because that's where Junhee originally wanted to go. Semi and Minsu would go together. Semi, even though it's not a team game, she'd still want a friend to recruit within the games, and so she'd tell Minsu to follow her to a shape which happens to be a circle. Dae-ho would be the one who chose circle. Alright, now we've got the stars to begin with the Thanos crew, which at this point consists of Thanos, Namgyu, and Jungsu, of course. The entire crew is just gonna follow Thanos' lead, and I figured Thanos is probably gonna say some BS about picking star because he's a quote-unquote rap star or something along those lines. Hyunju just so happens to pick star, and then In-ho, like how Il-nam let Giyun choose. Giyun would choose the umbrella, and then In-ho would take the star. Now, for our unlucky crew, this consists of Giyun, 246, and then Youngmi. Some people will have to be unlucky, and it just so happens that it's them. Everybody will end up passing, but Giyun would lick the cookies again, but our unlucky characters would be 256, 095, and 246. And I know, it's really sad, but not everybody can live. In the original Season 1, there was about a 58% survival rate for Dalgona. If you calculate that into our current amount of 365 people, that would be 212 people surviving. They would go on to get their lunch, purposely getting a smaller portion. Giyun would call for another vote, it would happen, but then the circles would still win. For the vote, it would look like this with the notable characters. Let's go through with the rationales. Right from the get-go, I know it looks like there's so many more X voters than the amount of circle voters, but that's just because it's the notable characters. Let's explain. Giyun's gang will of course follow his lead and vote X, but Jung-bae, who originally voted O, will vote X because his reasoning for voting O in the original Season 2 was that he thought that he could just play one more game to earn some more money, but in this scenario, you have to complete all the games to win any sort of money, so he wouldn't want to do that. Myung-gi would vote X because of Junie. Young-sik would vote X in this timeline because even though he needs money, he wouldn't want his mother to play all 6 games. And Minsu, now that he hasn't met Thanos and Namgyu yet, will vote X. On the other hand, for Team O, I shouldn't have to explain player 100. Hyunju will want the money for her surgeries. 390 will vote O because in Season 2, she said that she needed a certain amount of money, and if she didn't get it, she'd go to a place even worse than the Squid Game. Thanos and Namgyu would of course still vote O. So that's it with the vote. A combination of frustration from the vote and food portions being low will fuel anger among the players, but mostly due to the food portions like in the original Season 1. We're gonna say that in this timeline, player 100's gang will go ahead and get seconds, just like how Doksu's gang did in season 1. As a consequence, a bunch of people will be left without food, and one of those people will confront the gang. A member from the gang would rise up and fight that person, let's say player 203. Player 203 would beat that person up to death. In this timeline, Inho wouldn't get up to stop this being from happening because he knows that it has to happen in order for lights out to occur. Then, the players would all learn that they could kill each other and then increase the prize money by doing so. Because of this, lights out would occur. Before then, you would rile up a crew to talk about the rebellion, but that's for later. Lights out would occur. In the original season 2 Lights Out, there was about a survival rate of about 73%. Take 212 people, minus 1 to be 211 because of 203's kill, and then you get 153 players. After Lights Out, the rebellion recurs in the same way, minus 246 because he already got eliminated. Also, Hyunju wouldn't join the rebellion because in this timeline, she would want the money she could earn from the games. Thanos would attempt to join because he's just an idiot, but the frontman wouldn't let an idiot like him join. The rebellion fails, and now we've got 145 players left. Gyun would still be in the same depressive state he was originally in, and Daeho would still avoid Gyun, and now we're on the tug of war. I think in order to make the conditions of the tug of war game actually make sense and be fair, they'd make a few changes in this timeline. Here's why. In the season 1 tug of war conditions, it required 10 players per team. You try to do 10 players per team for 153 players, you would get 15 teams with 3 people left over. Each team faces and eliminates each other once, so if there's 15 teams, 1 team wouldn't get to play. So, I figured that the frontman would change the game to require 15 players per team, getting us to 10 teams. 3 players would be left over, and I think those players, in the same way that Minyo survived after not getting a partner, would remain in the game. Teams would look like this for the notable characters. I'm not gonna go full on in depth for the whole 15 players on the teams because it would all just be a bunch of background characters. I didn't bother to include Daeho or Myunggi because I figured they just find a team full of random background characters. To explain why each player joined each other, here we go. For Team 1, Thanos, like he did in the original Season 2 Six-Legged Pentathlon, he would go up to Minsu and Semi, and they'd agree to join Thanos like they originally did, marking the beginning of the actual Thanos crew. For Team 2, Gyun wouldn't bother to try to join others, but all the other players like Junhee or Young-sik or Goomja would join him because they would view him as strong. Hyunju would come because they would want to help Junhee. Player 100 would of course want to stay with his crew here. I'm not going to go more in depth about Tug, but the point is that all notable characters will live. Gyun wouldn't even bother to ask for a vote to occur, and for the present moment, nobody would want to call for a vote because the ones who would want a vote will be the ones who want this game to end, and it will be very clear that it would be impossible to secure a majority vote for X given the massive losses of X's during the rebellion. In this timeline, Goomja, accompanied by Young-sik, would talk to Gyun trying to get him to get his spark back, but Goomja wouldn't kill herself. Gyun still wouldn't get his spark back, however, because he only seemed moved after he saw that Goomja killed herself, so entering the next game, he would still enter the original dejected state he was in. There would be 75 players left, and the next game would be Marbles. Since the players all remember that in the previous games, those without partners would live, they'd probably explicitly say that whoever doesn't have a partner is eliminated this time. This would lead there to be 37 duos and then 1 person left over who would then be eliminated. This leftover person would be 044. Notable duos would look like this. Let's go through rationales. First 3 should be kind of self-explanatory here. For teams 4 and 5, I was kind of conflicted to Junhee partnering with Hyunju. Of course, I think it makes sense given Hyunju's protective nature, but I actually really wanted to write a storyline in which Junhee and Myunggi are a duo. However, I just can't see that happening because Junhee can already appear with Hyunju, and Junhee avoided Myunggi throughout the games. Myunggi would have gone up to Junhee, but she would have declined. This would have meant that Myunggi would have been solo, and that he would see solo Gyun in a corner. Myunggi would then go up to Gyun, saying that he admired his leadership during the rebellion. I know Daeho isn't on here, so we'll just say that he teamed up with a background character. Now, let's go through these. Team 1, Namgyu and Thanos. Once learning that they have to eliminate their partner at the pass, they would start bickering at each other, like how Doksu and his lackey did in Season 1. I think they'd play the same game when Doksu and his lackey did, where they throw marbles to a hole. They'd struggle, but after a while, Finalists would win. He'd mock Namgyu after getting it into the hole. Namgyu, like how Doksu's lackey did, would start running around the arena trying to escape, but it would be futile and he'd get gunned down. Team 2, Minsu and Semi. Semi and Minsu would just talk for the entire time about life like how Sabyok and Ji-young did. They'd play the same game that they did, in which they throw a marble close to a wall, but in the end, Minsu would just drop the marble. He thanked Semi, saying that she was the only person who ever made him feel something worth in life. He believes that Semi has more to live than him, and thus Semi would pass and Minsu would be eliminated. Team 3, Young-sik and Goomja. They'd cry after learning the game circumstances. Both would intentionally try to give each other their marbles, but they'd stop after a while because it would be impossible to sacrifice for someone when the other person is trying to do the same. So they'd end up playing the odd-even game, and after a while, Goomja would end up having a vast majority of the marbles, and she would be clearly upset about this. Young-sik would be sobbing that he's gonna die, but he accepted because he doesn't want to see his mother be dead. However, in the very last minute, Goomja would win all the marbles, but right before the guard is going to shoot Young-sik, she would hand the marbles over to him. Her final departing words to Young-sik would be to take care of Junhee. Young-sik would freeze in shock in this situation, and Goomja would go over to the guard and then she'd be shot. Team 4, Myung-gi and Gi-yoon. This one is interesting in my opinion. I don't think either would want to sacrifice for each other. Gi-yoon would still act depressed but would still try to win in this game. They'd end up playing the odd-even game, and after a while, Gi-yoon would get a vast majority of the marbles. Myung-gi would attempt to do some manipulation just like how Sang-woo did to Ali. Gi-yoon would definitely show some empathy towards Myung-gi and hear him out, but in the end, Gi-yoon wouldn't be deceived and Gi-yoon would pass and Myung-gi would get eliminated. Team 5, Hyunju and Junhee. I think Hyunju and Junhee would just talk for a little bit, figure they'd play the same game that Minsu and Semi played, but at the end, they wouldn't even play a game. Hyunju would just hand their marbles over to Junhee and then say to win the game for her child, and thus Hyunju would die, Junhee would pass. Team 6, okay. I really don't want to get into the storyline because I don't think it's all that interesting. Let's just say player 100 passes. Off camera, Daeho would also defeat his partner and then pass. In the end, 37 players would remain after marbles. Gi-yoon still doesn't have his spark back, and Junhee would cry in a corner after Hyunju's death, and also cry about the death of Myung-gi. Even though she acted cold towards him, it is evident that in the series that she still cared deep about him in her heart. Gi-yoon would still be depressed, but in this timeline, Young-sik would go up to Gi-yoon again and talk about how he and his mother never had the best relationship, but how he still loved her so much. He'd then talk about his mother's dying wish for him to protect Junhee, and he'd say that he doesn't trust himself to do it, and then ask Gi-yoon to carry out this task. The next morning, Gi-yoon would wake up to Young-sik's dead body after hanging himself. This would drive Gi-yoon to want to save people again, especially Junhee. The next game is Glass Bridges, and this is where things get really dicey. There are 18 glass tiles and 37 players, and this is the second to last game. They're going to need a small amount of players for the next game to commence, no? So, how can 37 people fit into Glass Bridges? I figured that the front man will divide the 37 players into 2 groups that enter the Glass Bridge game, with the second group that enters not having any idea about the context of the game. He would make it interesting for the VIPs and allow the players to choose their groups. The players would probably think that this is where the teams compete against each other, and thus all the groups would consist of people who have teamed throughout the games. I'm not going to go in depth about the entirety of all the groups. Let's just say that they say to form groups of 18, with one person to be eliminated who doesn't get on a team. A background character would then get eliminated. As I said, I'm not talking about the entirety of the 2 groups, but just the core characters who would be in each group. Groups would look like this. For rationales, fans will join the group with player 100 and his gang because he would have admired the way that they all voted O. Semi would go with Finalists because, like she said, druggies like him are easy to handle, and she would have thought that they could be useful. He could be useful in whatever game scenario they come across. Gi-yoon would go in the same group as Junhee to protect her, and Daeho would join the group solely because he doesn't want to be in the same group as player 100's gang. Group 1 would go first. I'm not going to go directly into exact team orders, but I figure player 100 will go as the 9th, with a bunch of his other gang members going from around the middle to the beginning. Finalists would have been hesitant in picking a number, leading him to pick the number 13, with Semi right behind him as 14. Semi would have intentionally gone behind Finalists to see what he would do. I think the vast number of selfish and greedy people in that group, I think they won't be able to get enough people willing to cross the tiles for others, and because of that, time would run out and they would all die. My rationale is that you can see people like Player 100, 203, and others in that group, and I don't think they're going to be willing to cross for others. Therefore, everyone in that group will die. Now, onto Group 2. Gyun would actually, before the game begins, tell Daeho that he forgives him in this timeline, but that would serve nothing as simply just adding emotional depth to the story. As for the important part, the order in which players would go, would have Gyun going first and then Junhee last with Daeho second to last. Yeah, I know. Gyun going first means he gets eliminated, but that's the point of the story. Gyun going first would be his last attempt at trying to save lives, and once the daunting reality would set upon him learning the context of the game, he wouldn't try to hold up everyone on the bridge, he'd just go himself. But for Junhee and Daeho, Gyun would have instructed Junhee to go last because she is pregnant, and going earlier could be dangerous, with Daeho being just cowardly would have picked a spot closer to the end. Now, let's say out of Group 2, only 3 people survived. These people would have been Daeho, Junhee, and an unspecified background character. Alright, now we've got our finalists, so let's take a look at it. I just added 039 as our third finalist because I just needed a background character, and it makes sense for someone like him of cowardly nature to be the one. He probably would have chosen a number near the back if he was in Glass Bridges, so I think that this is kind of believable in my opinion. A vote would be called for by either Junhee or 039 during the final dinner, and then get this, Junhee would vote for X. Daeho would vote for Circle. Here's why. In the first vote in original Season 2, Daeho voted Circle but then voted X the rest of the games. He only voted Circle because he needed a little bit of money and thought that playing one more game would be easy enough and he could live. When Daeho knows that there's only one more game to play and he could win almost all the money, he'd take it. Now, it's up to 039. He's the deciding vote. In this timeline, I think we'll vote for X actually. He voted X the entirety of Season 2 until he saw what the circles were capable of. And then in this timeline, if it was known that he could be a decider, what am I talking about? He would take it. End to end, Daeho, Junhee, and the Lunchbox guy would be the only survivors. And with that is the end of the video. Thank you guys for watching, and if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. See you next time.